learn more about the nuclear threat, I spoke earlier to one of the world's foremost experts on nuclear power. Professor Richard Lester is the head of the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I asked him what Japanese authorities need to do to control and contain the release of any radioactive materials.
What the operators have to do at this point is really three things. They have to try to make sure that the fuel in the reactor remains cool enough to prevent any further damage to the fuel, and that requires keeping the fuel covered at all times with water. The second thing they have to do is to make sure that pressure is not rising to risky levels throughout the reactor system. And the third thing that they have to do is to ensure that hydrogen, which may be being produced in the reactor as a result of chemical reactions between the steam in the reactor and the fuel cladding, they have to make sure that hydrogen doesn't further accumulate and risk another explosion.
We know the Japanese authorities are pumping seawater laced with the chemical element boron into two of the reactors to try to cool them down. When will we know if that's working, along with those other measures that you just outlined?
Probably the most direct way to tell whether it's working or not is for measurements to be made, and of course they are making these measurements, in the near vicinity of the plant, of radiation levels, radioactivity levels. The latest figures that I saw suggest that if you were at the site boundary, it would take a couple of hours for you to actually receive a radiation dose equivalent to what you would get from a routine chest X-ray. If that's correct, if those figures are correct, that means that further away from the plant, the radiation doses would be extremely low. Nevertheless, given the possibility of further radiation releases, I do think it's prudent for the authorities to have taken the actions that they've taken to evacuate the population to what is actually a fairly substantial distance, 12.5 miles.
Most viewers would have heard of Chernobyl and the nuclear disaster there in 1986. Can you just give us some context by explaining how this situation differs to that one?
The Chernobyl reactor essentially had no containment. It had no secondary barrier outside the reactor vessel. That is not the case at Fukushima, and the secondary and actually tertiary barriers have actually played so far an important role in maintaining the radioactivity to a very great extent inside the reactor system, as opposed to what happened at Chernobyl, where very large amounts of radiation were released from the reactor vessel and had no place to go other than out into the atmosphere.
Japan's nuclear industry provides about 30% of the country's electricity. What sort of struggle does that mean Japan's going to have over the short term to meet its energy needs?
I think the Japanese nuclear fleet provides something like a third of Japan's electricity. Some considerable portion of that, not only the units at Fukushima Daiichi, but also Fukushima Daini, and probably at several other sites that are within the zone affected by the earthquake and the tsunami, will probably have to remain closed for a very substantial period. Of course, the two reactors that have been worst affected at Fukushima Daiichi, units 1 and 3, will almost certainly never reopen as a result of the action by the operators to flood these reactors with salt water. Those two reactors are essentially written off. The number of reactors that will be able to restart at some point in the future is unclear. I've seen one estimate that the current contribution of about 35% of Japan's electricity from the nuclear plants may be reduced to something like 15 to 20% for at least the foreseeable future as a result of the earthquake. If that's the case, the Japanese will certainly have to struggle to come up with replacement power. And I would guess that that would be a real challenge for the electric power system in the coming months.
Professor Richard Lester there from MIT.